Hi everyone and welcome back to Heimler's History. In this lecture we're going to talk about how World War I was the primary conflict that led to the American Revolution. And if you have any sense of the timeline of history, you know that what we call World War I started in 1914, and you may be wondering how what I just said is possible. Well, maybe it's not possible and you're just drunk on cheese and therefore not fit to be instructing the minds of young people. Yes, it is true that I've had more than my fair share of cheese this morning, but I am thinking clear, and so let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
What if I told you that World War I is not really World War I? There is no spoon. In fact, the very first World War began between Britain and France on the American continent in 1754, and it was this conflict that we know as the French and Indian War that eventually pulled the pin on the grenade that would be the American Revolution. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's stop and talk about the French and Indian War. Okay, let's begin with geography. The French and Indian War was fought over land claims in the Ohio River Valley that you see here in green. Now, the Ohio country was the critical area which British colonists wanted to push into and establish new settlements, but there was a problem. That land belonged to the French, and they were hot to keep it because it connected their Canadian holdings with the lower Mississippi River Valley, which was oh so critical to trade and commerce. Enter a fresh and sprightly 21-year-old George Washington. Now, the Washington family had secured rights to a 500-acre tract of land in the Ohio River Valley, while at the same time the French were busy building military forts up and down that land. And George Washington got mad about this and was all, "I'ma chop y'all down like a cherry tree and eat you with my wooden teeth, y'all don't back off." And the French were all,
"Your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries."
Well, that kind of taunting was enough for Washington to lead 150 militiamen out to that tract of land to begin firing away at the French. And long story short, the French bested Washington in that little skirmish and sent him packing back to Mount Vernon, where he bit his pillow hard and dreamed of revenge against the French. Now, that little skirmish turned into other little skirmishes, which in turn led to bigger skirmishes, which in turn erupted into a global war that was fought in the Americas, Europe, the West Indies, the Philippines, Africa, and the ocean. Now, the Americans call this the French and Indian War. The British call it the 7 Years' War, but whatever you call it, it was the first truly global conflict. Hence, World War I. Now, a lot of this conflict was fought on the European continent, and that has lots of implications for European history, but that doesn't concern us at this point. Like good Americans, we're only concerned with what happened in America. And the truth is, we're not that concerned with the battle or how it was fought or its military outcomes. The really important piece for our purposes is to realize that the British beat the French on the American continent, and in doing so, won all the land from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. That's a lot of land, Tony. So this victory made the American colonists proud to be British citizens, not least because now with this victory they could push into the interior of the continent and begin settling there. But wouldn't you know it, those pesky Indians that lived there thought their ancestral lands were their ancestral lands. And so the first pioneers who ventured to settle in the Ohio River Valley met with stiff opposition. In fact, so incensed were the Ottawa Indians at this fresh flow of whiteness squatting on their lands that their chief, Pontiac, led an uprising near Detroit in which they killed almost 2,000 settlers. And so this made Parliament stop for a minute and consider the safety of their dear colonists. As a result, they passed a law known as the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited the settling of the Ohio River Valley until they could figure out the Indian problem. Now, the British Parliament did this to protect the lives of the American colonists who were under their care. But the American colonists themselves were peeved because it was their blood that was spilled in purchasing this land in the war, and they thought it was their birthright. So those Americans did what those Americans will continue to do in this period. They went and settled the land anyway. Okay, let's leave that little tension over to the side for a minute. So as you might expect, a conflict of the magnitude of the French and Indian War required an equal magnitude of English hooch to pay for it. And where was that hooch going to come from? Taxes! Parliament thought it was eminently reasonable to pass laws to tax the Americans to help pay for a war that both extended their territory and kept them safe from the menacing threat of the French. And I just want to mention two of these laws for the moment. First was the Sugar Act of 1764. This was the first law that the British Parliament ever passed that raised tax revenue in the American colonies. It basically just put a tax on the importation of sugar into the Americas. And for Americans, Sugar is like a food group. So when the Americans protested loudly about this, Parliament backed down and lowered the taxes. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, which angered the colonists even more. It was a simple stamp that had to be paid for and then affixed to any colonial printed material. And oh, how this new tax stunk in the colonial nostril. They raised their voices in defiance, shouting, "No taxation without representation." And what they meant by that was that the British Parliament was supposed to be a lawmaking body that represented all British citizens. The problem was not one member of Parliament was from the colonies. And the British Prime Minister George Grenville thought this was a dumb complaint and said that in fact Americans were represented in the British Parliament, but they were represented by something called virtual representation, which meant that one British citizen represents all British citizens. Which is kind of like your dad winning the lottery, and when you ask him why he bought 9 new cars for himself while you're still driving a 71 Ford Pinto, he says, "Well, since I'm your dad and you're my daughter, we're related, so that means you virtually won the lottery too." But at the end of the day, you're still driving a Pinto. And anyone who's ever driven a Pinto knows that if you drive it long enough, it's enough to make you want to start a bloody revolution. But we'll end there for now, and I will see you next time.